The evening sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Rosie's Diner, a small roadside establishment that had served travelers and locals in rural Montana for over 30 years. Inside the cozy restaurant with its red vinyl booths and checkered floor, the smell of fresh coffee and grilled burgers filled the air. At a corner booth near the window sat Marcus Johnson with his family, enjoying what should have been a peaceful dinner during his rare leave from duty. Marcus was a tall man with kind eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility. He wore simple civilian clothes, a blue button-down shirt and jeans, wanting nothing more than to blend in and enjoy time with the people he loved most. Across from him sat his wife Elena, a beautiful woman with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile. Their son Danny, aged 10, was enthusiastically telling a story about his science project while 7-year-old Maya colored on the paper placemat with crayons the Yao waitress had brought. The family laughed together as Danny explained how his volcano experiment had gone wrong and covered half the classroom in baking soda foam. Elena shook her head with amusement, reminding her son that he needed to follow instructions more carefully next time. Marcus reached over and ruffled Danny's hair, telling him that mistakes were how people learned. Maya looked up from her drawing and asked her father when he had to go back to work. Marcus's expression softened as he told his daughter he had 2 more weeks at home with them. The waitress, a young woman named Carla, brought their food to the table. She set down burgers for Marcus and Danny, a salad for Elena, and chicken tenders with fries for Maya. She smiled at the family and told them to enjoy their meal, mentioning that she would check back in a few minutes. Marcus thanked her and the family began to eat, continuing their conversation about school and upcoming plans for Marcus's leave. Everything changed when the door to the diner opened and 2 police officers walked inside. Deputy Kyle Harris was a stocky man in his mid-30s with a stern face and cold eyes. His partner, Officer Greg Norton, was younger and thinner, but carried the same aggressive posture. They scanned the diner as if looking for something specific, and their eyes landed on the Johnson family almost immediately. The officers exchanged a glance and began walking toward the corner booth. Other patrons in the diner noticed the movement and conversations began to quiet down. Elena looked up and saw the officers approaching, and a small frown of concern crossed her face. Marcus had already noticed them from the corner of his eye but continued eating calmly, hoping they were simply making their rounds. Deputy Harris stopped directly beside their table and stood there without saying anything for a long moment. Marcus looked up and met his eyes, offering a polite nod. The deputy did not return the greeting. Instead, he crossed his arms and asked Marcus if he could see some identification. His tone was not friendly or professional, but carried an edge of suspicion that seemed entirely unwarranted. Marcus kept his voice calm and asked if there was a problem. Deputy Harris replied that there had been reports of suspicious activity in the area, and he needed to verify everyone's identity. Elena's frown deepened as she pointed out that they were just having dinner as a family. Officer Norton stepped closer to the table, his hand resting on his belt near his equipment, and told her that they would determine what was or was not suspicious. Danny and Maya had stopped eating and were watching the officers with wide, confused eyes. Marcus reached into his wallet and pulled out his identification card, handing it to Deputy Harris without argument. He wanted to de-escalate the situation quickly for his children's sake. The deputy took the card and examined it with exaggerated scrutiny, holding it up to the light and comparing the photo to Marcus's face multiple times. After what felt like an unnecessarily long inspection, Deputy Harris handed the card to his partner and declared that it looked fake. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady as he assured the officers that his identification was completely legitimate. Norton studied the card and made a show of pointing out supposed inconsistencies, though any trained officer would have recognized it as valid government identification. Elena spoke up again, her voice carrying a note of frustration as she asked what exactly they were being accused of doing wrong. Deputy Harris turned his attention to her and said that her attitude was not helping the situation. He suggested that if the family had nothing to hide, they would cooperate fully with the investigation. Marcus placed his hand on Elena's arm gently, a silent message to stay calm. The deputy pulled out a small notepad and began asking questions. Where were they from? What were they doing in this town? How long did they plan to stay? Where were they going after dinner? Marcus answered each question politely and directly. They lived 2 hours north. They were passing through on their way home from visiting Elena's parents, and they stopped because the children were hungry. None of these answers seemed to satisfy Deputy Harris. He made notes in his pad while exchanging meaningful looks with his partner. Other diners were now openly watching the confrontation, some with expressions of discomfort, others with curiosity. A few people had their phones out, though it was unclear if they were recording or simply scrolling nervously. Officer Norton walked around to the other side of the booth, effectively boxing the family in. He asked Marcus what he did for work. Marcus replied simply that he worked for the government. This answer clearly did not please the officers. Deputy Harris demanded more specifics, asking what kind of government work and what agency employed him. Marcus explained that some of his work was classified and he could only provide basic information. The word classified seemed to trigger something in Deputy Harris. His expression hardened, and he told Marcus that refusing to answer questions fully was a red flag. Marcus calmly stated that he was not refusing anything, but rather following the protocols of his employment regarding sensitive information. He offered to provide a contact number for his supervisor if verification was needed. Deputy Harris ignored this offer and instead told Marcus to step outside with them for further questioning. Elena's eyes widened with alarm, and she asked why that was necessary when they had done nothing wrong. Norton told her to stay quiet or she could be charged with obstruction of justice. Maya started to cry quietly, pressing herself against her mother's side. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest but forced it down through years of discipline and training. He looked at his frightened daughter and then back at the officers. In a voice that carried more authority than before, he stated clearly that he had provided identification, answered their questions, and his family had committed no crime. They had every right to finish their meal in peace. The deputy's face flushed red at what he perceived as defiance. He reached for his radio and called for backup, speaking into it about a potentially confrontational situation requiring additional units. The atmosphere in the diner had become thick with tension. Some patrons looked away uncomfortably, while others continued to watch the scene unfold. Marcus's military watch, a sleek device on his left wrist, began recording automatically as its sensors detected the elevated stress levels and confrontational situation. The technology was far more advanced than anything available to civilians, but it looked simple enough not to draw attention. Marcus sat perfectly still, his training keeping him composed even as his heart rate increased with protective instinct for his family. Betty, the elderly owner of the diner, emerged from behind the counter. She was a small woman in her 70s with white hair and sharp eyes. She approached the officers and spoke in a firm voice, telling them that the Johnson family were good people who had been coming to her diner for years whenever they passed through town. They had never caused any trouble, and she would appreciate it if the officers would leave them alone to enjoy their meal. Deputy Harris turned to Betty with an expression of irritation. He told her to mind her own business or she could face charges for interfering with a police investigation. Betty stood her ground, saying that what happened in her establishment was very much her business. Officer Norton suggested that perhaps she was harboring suspicious individuals, and that her diner could be investigated as well. The threat hung in the air as more customers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. No one intervened directly, but the mood had shifted entirely from the peaceful evening atmosphere of minutes before. Marcus glanced at his children, both frightened and confused, and made a decision to remain calm no matter what happened next, knowing that his reaction would be watched and judged far more harshly than the officer's behavior. The situation inside Rosie's diner continued to deteriorate as the minutes passed. Deputy Harris seemed to interpret Marcus's calm demeanor as some form of disrespect, rather than the restraint it actually was. He leaned closer to the table and asked Marcus again to step outside, this time with less pretense of politeness and more direct command in his voice. Marcus remained seated and replied that he would prefer to stay with his family. Elena had wrapped her arm around Maya, who was still crying softly into her mother's side. Danny sat frozen in his seat, his burger forgotten on the plate in front of him. The boy's eyes moved between his father and the officers, trying to understand why these men in uniforms were treating his family this way. Officer Norton circled back around the booth and stood directly behind Marcus, a tactical position meant to intimidate. He asked why Marcus was being so difficult when all they wanted was to ask a few questions. Marcus turned his head slightly to look at the younger officer and explained in an even tone that he had already answered every question asked of him and provided his identification as requested. He saw no reason why the situation needed to escalate further. Deputy Harris made a show of pulling out his radio again and spoke into it with exaggerated clarity. He reported to dispatch that he had an uncooperative individual who was refusing lawful orders and creating a disturbance at a local business. Several patrons who had been watching shook their heads at this blatant mischaracterization of events, but no one spoke up to contradict the officer's report. Elena's protective instincts overrode her caution, and she spoke up firmly, asking the officers to please lower their voices because they were frightening her children. Deputy Harris turned his attention to her with a cold smile and said that if she continued to interfere with their investigation, she would be arrested for obstruction. The threat was clear and designed to silence her. Marcus felt his hands clench under the table but kept his face neutral. Years of commanding soldiers in life-threatening situations had taught him ironclad control over his reactions. He knew that any sign of aggression would be used against him and put his family at greater risk. Instead, he moved slightly to place himself more clearly between the officers and his wife and children, a subtle protective gesture that came from deep instinct. The door to the diner opened and a third officer entered. This was Sheriff Paul Dixon, a heavy-set man in his 50s with gray hair and a weathered face that showed years of authority unchallenged. He scanned the room quickly and his eyes settled on the scene at the corner booth. Without asking his deputies what was happening or seeking any context, he walked directly over with the assumption that his men were in the right. Deputy Harris straightened up as his superior approached and gave a quick rundown of the situation as he saw it. He claimed they had received reports of suspicious individuals, that Marcus had provided questionable identification, and that the family was being uncooperative with their investigation. Every point was either exaggerated or outright false, but the sheriff nodded along as if the account was perfectly reasonable. "Sheriff," Dixon looked down at Marcus with an expression of barely concealed contempt. He stated flatly that the family needed to leave the premises immediately. When Marcus asked on what grounds they were being asked to leave, the sheriff replied that he did not need grounds beyond his authority as the ranking law enforcement officer in the county. He suggested that Marcus could either leave voluntarily or be escorted out in handcuffs. Betty stepped forward again, her voice shaking slightly with anger now, rather than fear. She told the sheriff that this was her establishment and the Johnson family was welcome there. She had not asked them to leave and saw no reason why they should be forced to go. The sheriff turned to her with a warning look and advised her not to make the situation worse for herself. Marcus could see the fear in Betty's eyes despite her brave words. He did not want this kind woman to suffer consequences for trying to defend his family. He took a breath and prepared to suggest they would leave peacefully to avoid further conflict. But before he could speak, Elena's voice cut through the tension. She asked the sheriff directly what law her family had broken. Her voice was steady despite the fear Marcus could see in her eyes. She pointed out that they had done nothing but sit down for a meal, that they had complied with every request, and that this treatment was unwarranted and appeared to be motivated by something other than legitimate law enforcement concerns. The implication in her words was clear to everyone in the diner. Several patrons shifted uncomfortably because they recognized the truth in what Elena was saying. The officers were not treating the Johnson family this way because of any real suspicion of criminal activity. They were doing it because of how the family looked, pure and simple prejudice dressed up in the language of public safety. Sheriff Dixon's face reddened at the suggestion. He told Elena that she was very close to being arrested herself and that she should consider the welfare of her children before she continued making accusations. The threat against her children made Elena's eyes flash with anger, but Marcus squeezed her hand gently under the table, asking her silently to let him handle this. Officer Norton had pulled out his phone and was now taking photographs of the family without asking permission or explaining why such documentation was necessary. Danny asked his mother in a small voice why the policeman was taking their pictures. Elena had no good answer to give her son. Maya had stopped crying but sat pressed against her mother with wide, frightened eyes that broke Marcus's heart. Deputy Harris informed Marcus that they would need to search the family's vehicle as part of their investigation. Marcus asked what probable cause they had for such a search. The deputy replied that Marcus's uncooperative attitude and suspicious responses gave them all the cause they needed. This was a clear violation of constitutional rights, but the officers seemed confident that no one would challenge their authority. Marcus's military watch continued its silent recording, capturing audio and video of everything happening. The device was programmed to recognize situations where its wearer might be in danger or facing unlawful treatment, and it had automatically begun transmitting encrypted data to a secure server. Marcus was not yet aware that his location and situation had been flagged in the military's monitoring system. The sheriff pulled out a pair of handcuffs and held them where Marcus could see them clearly. He said that Marcus had one final chance to cooperate fully, which meant stepping outside for questioning, allowing a vehicle search, and providing detailed information about his employment and purpose for being in the area. If Marcus refused any of these demands, he would be arrested for disorderly conduct and resisting lawful orders. Around the diner, several patrons had their phones out now, some clearly recording the confrontation. One older man near the counter shook his head in disgust and muttered something about shame, though he did not speak loudly enough for the officers to hear clearly. A younger couple in a nearby booth looked distressed but did nothing to intervene, likely afraid of becoming targets themselves. Marcus looked at his children and then at his wife. He saw the fear in their eyes and the tension in Elena's shoulders. He thought about the countless battles he had fought in the depths of space, facing enemies that wanted to exterminate all of humanity. He had led soldiers through impossible situations and made decisions that saved thousands of lives. Yet here, in a small diner on Earth, he found himself powerless to protect his family from this arbitrary cruelty. He made his decision and began to slide out of the booth, intending to go with the officers and spare his family further trauma. If he complied fully, perhaps they would lose interest and let Elena and the children leave in peace. His military training had prepared him to endure far worse than whatever these small-town officers could dish out during questioning. But as Marcus stood up, his watch suddenly lit up with a bright blue glow. A holographic display projected from the device, showing a seal that made Deputy Harassed take a step backward. The seal was unmistakable to anyone who followed interplanetary affairs. A golden eagle with spread wings holding a shield decorated with stars and planets, surrounded by text that read, United Earth Space Command. The diner fell completely silent as a calm, authoritative female voice came from the watch's speaker. She addressed Marcus by his rank, asking for an immediate status report. The voice belonged to Admiral Christine Hayes, one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire space military. She asked if Commander Johnson was secure and able to respond. Every eye in the diner was now fixed on Marcus and the glowing device on his wrist. Sheriff Dixon's mouth had fallen slightly open. Deputy Harris and Officer Norton stood frozen, confusion and the first hints of concern crossing their faces. Betty's expression had changed from worry to something like vindication. Marcus straightened his shoulders and his entire bearing shifted. The mild-mannered father who had been sitting peacefully with his family seemed to transform into something else entirely. His voice, when he responded to the Admiral, carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly. He reported that he was currently engaged with local law enforcement, but was unharmed and in no immediate danger. The holographic display from Marcus's watch continued to glow softly in the dimmed lighting of the diner, casting blue light across the faces of everyone nearby. Admiral Hayes waited for Sheriff Dixon's response with the kind of patience that made clear she expected a full and honest answer. The sheriff cleared his throat and tried to regain some of his earlier authority, but his voice had lost its aggressive edge. He explained that his officers were simply doing their jobs by investigating suspicious activity in the area. When the Admiral asked what specific suspicious activity the Johnson family had been engaged in, Sheriff Dixon faltered. He mentioned that they had received reports, though he could not specify what those reports contained, or who had made them. His explanation became increasingly vague as he realized how little actual justification existed for the confrontation. Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone making an official report. He stated clearly that his family had entered the diner, ordered food, and been eating peacefully when approached by the officers without provocation. He confirmed that he had provided identification when requested and answered all questions asked of him. He had at no point been disorderly, resistant, or confrontational until the officers had threatened to separate him from his family. Admiral Hayes asked Marcus directly if he felt the treatment his family received was appropriate given the circumstances. Marcus paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. He replied that he believed the situation had escalated beyond what was warranted by the facts, and that his children had been unnecessarily frightened by the officer's aggressive approach. The sheriff tried to interrupt, claiming that Marcus had been uncooperative, but the admiral cut him off sharply. She stated that she had access to the recording from Commander Johnson's device and could review the entire interaction herself. She asked if the sheriff was certain he wanted to maintain his characterization of events, knowing that an objective record existed. Sheriff Dixon's face went pale as he realized the implications. Everything that had happened had been captured by military-grade recording equipment. Every threat, every exaggeration, every moment of harassment was documented and likely already stored on secure servers beyond his ability to influence or destroy. Officer Norton and Deputy Harris exchanged worried glances behind their superior. Marcus remained standing at parade rest, a military posture so ingrained that it came naturally even in civilian clothes. His hands were clasped behind his back and his spine was perfectly straight. Danny was staring at his father with a mixture of confusion and awe, beginning to understand that the dad who helped with homework and played catch in the backyard was someone very different when wearing his uniform. Admiral Hayes continued speaking to the sheriff, her voice taking on an educational tone that somehow made her words cut deeper. She explained that Commander Johnson was not merely a service member, but one of the most decorated officers in the United Earth Space Command. She asked if the sheriff was familiar with the Battle of Kepler Station. The sheriff admitted he was not. A few of the diner patrons, however, clearly recognized the name. An older man at the counter straightened up with sudden attention. A middle-aged woman gasped softly. The Battle of Kepler Station had been one of the defining moments of the war against the alien force known as the Vrex, a conflict that had threatened human extinction just 5 years earlier. The admiral provided a brief summary. Kepler Station had been a civilian mining facility, housing over 50,000 people when the Vrex attacked. The station's defenses were minimal, and military reinforcements were days away. Commander Johnson, then a captain, had been on the station during a routine inspection. When the attack began, he took command of the desperate defense using whatever resources were available. For 72 hours, Marcus had coordinated miners, security personnel, and the handful of military staff into an effective fighting force. He had personally led 3 counterattacks to retake critical systems and had piloted a damaged supply ship to manually deliver explosives that destroyed the VREX command vessel. His actions had saved every civilian on that station and turned what should have been a massacre into a strategic victory. The diner was absolutely silent as Admiral Hayes spoke. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to listen. Betty had tears in her eyes as she looked at Marcus with newfound understanding. Elena watched her husband with pride mixed with the familiar ache of knowing how close she had come to losing him during that battle. Sheriff Dixon attempted to speak, but seemed unable to find words. Deputy Harris had taken several steps back from the table, his earlier aggression replaced with obvious discomfort. Officer Norton was staring at his boots, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Admiral Hayes was not finished. She continued by listing Marcus's other accomplishments. He had received the Star of Valor, the highest military honor available for his actions at Kepler. He had been decorated by the governments of Mars, Europa, Titan, and 2 other colony worlds for various acts of heroism. He had personally trained over 300 officers in advanced tactical operations, many of whom had gone on to save countless lives using his methods. The admiral's voice softened slightly as she added that Commander Johnson was also a devoted father and husband who had requested this leave to spend time with his family after 14 months of continuous deployment. He had specifically chosen not to travel with his assigned security detail because he wanted his children to have a normal experience, free from the attention that his status usually brought. Marcus's jaw tightened at this mention of his family. He glanced back at Elena and the children, offering them a small reassuring nod. Maya had stopped crying and was watching the glowing device on her father's wrist with fascination. Danny was sitting up straighter, and there was a new expression on his face that looked like pride fighting with lingering fear. Admiral Hayes asked Sheriff Dixon a direct question. Given everything he now knew about Commander Johnson, did the sheriff believe that this man posed any legitimate threat to public safety? Did he honestly think that a war hero who had saved thousands of lives was in his diner planning criminal activity with his wife and young children? The sheriff had no answer that would not make him look foolish. He mumbled something about not having known who Marcus was, which prompted the admiral to point out that ignorance of a person's achievements did not justify treating them as criminals without cause. Every citizen deserved to be treated with basic dignity and respect by law enforcement, regardless of their background or appearance. Betty could not contain herself any longer. She stepped forward and addressed the sheriff directly, her voice shaking with emotion. She said that she had been telling him from the beginning that the Johnson family were good people who had done nothing wrong. She asked why her word as a business owner and member of this community for 40 years had meant nothing to him. Sheriff Dixon did not answer Betty either. He stood silent and increasingly isolated as the weight of his actions became clear. Several of the diner patrons were now openly recording the conversation on their phones, and a few had already begun posting updates to social media. Within minutes, word would spread far beyond this small Montana town. Marcus spoke again, his voice calm but carrying undeniable authority. He stated that he appreciated the admiral's intervention, but that he did not wish to make this situation more complicated than necessary. He simply wanted to finish dinner with his family and continue their journey home. Without further harassment, the admiral acknowledged his request, but stated firmly that there would be consequences for what had occurred. She informed Sheriff Dixon that military legal affairs would be reviewing the incident and that his department should expect inquiries from federal civil rights investigators. She added that the safety and dignity of service members and their families was taken very seriously by the United Earth Space Command. Officer Norton finally found his voice and stammered an apology. He said that they had not known who Marcus was and had not intended any disrespect. Marcus turned to look at the young officer with an expression that was hard to read. He asked quietly whether not knowing someone's rank or achievements should have mattered at all in how they were treated. The question hung in the air unanswered. The implication was obvious to everyone listening. The officers had not harassed the Johnson family because they seemed suspicious. They had done so because of assumptions based on nothing more than appearance, assumptions that revealed ugly prejudices hidden beneath the authority of their badges. Deputy Harris remained silent, but his face had gone red with what might have been shame or might have been suppressed anger at being called out. He had been so confident in his authority just minutes before, but now stood diminished in front of witnesses who had seen his behavior exposed for what it truly was. Admiral Hayes informed Marcus that a military security team was already in transit to his location and would arrive within 20 minutes. She asked if he required their immediate assistance or if he felt safe to wait. Marcus looked around the diner at the various faces watching him, then at the 3 law enforcement officers who no longer seemed quite so threatening. The atmosphere inside Rosie's diner had shifted completely from what it had been just 30 minutes earlier. What had started as a quiet family dinner had transformed into something that would be discussed and analyzed for months to come. Marcus sat with his family, trying to restore some sense of normalcy despite the extraordinary circumstances. Elena had ordered fresh meals for the children since their original food had gone cold during the confrontation. Sheriff Dixon stood near the entrance with his 2 deputies, making occasional radio calls but mostly just waiting. The 3 officers spoke in low voices among themselves, occasionally glancing toward Marcus's table with expressions that ranged from resentment to worry. They knew they had made a serious mistake, but seemed unable to fully grasp just how serious the consequences might be. Several more patrons had entered the diner during the wait, drawn by messages from friends already inside or by posts on social media that were beginning to circulate. Word was spreading rapidly that something significant was happening at the old roadside establishment. Betty had to ask people to either order food or wait outside, as the small diner was becoming crowded beyond its normal capacity. Marcus checked his watch, noting that 15 minutes had passed since Admiral Hayes had called. The holographic display had reduced to a small indicator light showing that the channel remained open and monitored. He could see vehicles beginning to gather in the parking lot through the window, Though most appeared to be curious locals rather than anyone official, Danny had been quiet since learning about his father's military achievements, processing this new information about the man he had always known simply as Dad. He finally asked Marcus what the Vrex looked like. Marcus considered how to answer in a way that would not give his young son nightmares. He explained that they were very different from humans, more like large insects than anything else, but that they were intelligent and had their own reasons for their actions. Maya wanted to know if her daddy had been scared when fighting the aliens. Marcus looked at his daughter and answered honestly that yes, he had been very scared many times, but that being brave did not mean not feeling fear. It meant doing what needed to be done even when you were afraid. Elena smiled at this answer, proud of her husband's honesty with their children. The sound of approaching vehicles became more distinct, and several people near the windows reported seeing military trucks pulling into the parking lot. Betty unlocked the front door as a precaution, sensing that the situation was about to change again. Sheriff Dixon straightened his uniform and tried to compose himself, clearly anxious about what was coming next. 3 large black vehicles came to a stop outside the diner in a precise formation. The doors opened simultaneously, and personnel in crisp military uniforms emerged with practiced efficiency. They moved with purpose but without aggression, establishing a secure perimeter around the building. The lead officer, a tall man with colonel insignia on his shoulders, entered the diner and immediately scanned the room until his eyes found Marcus. Colonel Andrew Pierce was a distinguished-looking man in his early 50s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes. He had served with Marcus on multiple campaigns and considered the younger officer both a friend and one of the finest commanders he had ever known. When he saw Marcus sitting in a booth with his family, surrounded by the residue of what was clearly an unpleasant situation, his expression hardened. The colonel approached the table and came to attention, delivering a crisp salute that Marcus returned even while seated. Colonel Pierce asked if the commander and his family were well and unharmed. Marcus confirmed that they were physically fine, though he glanced at his children as he said it, acknowledging without words that there were different kinds of harm beyond the physical. Sheriff Dixon stepped forward and attempted to introduce himself, but Colonel Pierce held up a hand to stop him. The colonel stated that he would speak with local law enforcement after ensuring the security and well-being of Commander Johnson and his family. The dismissal was polite but absolute, leaving the sheriff standing awkwardly to the side. Colonel Pierce asked Marcus for a brief report on what had occurred. Marcus provided a concise summary, sticking to facts without editorial comment. He explained that his family had been eating dinner when approached by local officers, that he had complied with all requests for identification and information, and that the situation had escalated despite no lawful cause for detention or investigation. The colonel listened with an increasingly stern expression. When Marcus finished, Colonel Pierce asked if he had felt threatened at any point. Marcus paused before answering, aware that his response would carry weight. He said that while he personally had not felt physically threatened, he had been concerned for his wife and children's safety, given the aggressive posture and escalating threats from the officers. Elena added quietly that yes, she had felt threatened, especially when the officers had mentioned Child Protective Services and suggested they might search the family's vehicle without cause. Her voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of anger that had been building since the confrontation began. Colonel Pierce nodded seriously and made a note on a tablet one of his subordinates handed him. The colonel turned to face Sheriff Dixon and his deputies, his demeanor shifting from concerned colleague to commanding officer, addressing a serious failure. He asked the sheriff to provide his version of events. Dixon's account was notably different in tone from Marcus's, emphasizing the routine nature of the stop and downplaying the aggressive elements that multiple witnesses had observed. Colonel Pierce listened without interrupting until the sheriff finished. Then he asked a series of pointed questions. What specific suspicious activity had prompted the initial approach? What probable cause existed for threatening to search the family's vehicle? What justification could be offered for the aggressive posture and threats made in front of young children? Sheriff Dixon struggled to provide satisfactory answers to any of these questions. His responses became increasingly defensive as the colonel's questions exposed the lack of legitimate law enforcement rationale for the officer's actions. Deputy Harris attempted to support his superior's account but only succeeded in revealing additional inconsistencies. Colonel Pierce produced his own tablet and informed the sheriff that he had reviewed the complete recording from Commander Johnson's device. He stated flatly that the recording contradicted several claims made by the local officers and clearly showed a pattern of harassment rather than legitimate investigation. He asked if the sheriff wished to revise his statement given this objective evidence, so the color drained from Sheriff Dixon's face as he realized that his attempt to minimize and justify his department's actions had failed completely. He mumbled something about misunderstandings and different perspectives, but the words sounded hollow even to himself. Officer Norton looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, while Deputy Harris had crossed his arms defensively. Betty approached Colonel Pierce and introduced herself as the diner's owner. She stated clearly that she had witnessed the entire incident and that the Johnson family had done absolutely nothing to warrant the treatment they received. She added that she had tried to intervene on their behalf but had been threatened with legal consequences by the officers for doing so. The colonel thanked Betty for her statement and asked if her diner had security cameras. Betty confirmed that it did, and that the footage was saved automatically to a cloud storage system. Colonel Pierce requested access to that footage for the official investigation, and Betty agreed immediately, clearly eager to help document what had occurred. Several other patrons also stepped forward to offer statements supporting Marcus and his family. The older man, who had recognized the Battle of Kepler Station, said he had recorded much of the confrontation on his phone and would be happy to provide that recording to military investigators. A younger woman offered similar evidence from her own device. Colonel Pierce accepted all offers of evidence and assigned one of his staff to collect contact information from everyone willing to serve as witnesses. He explained that there would be a thorough investigation into the incident and that all relevant evidence would be preserved and reviewed. His tone made clear that this was not a casual inquiry but a serious matter that would be pursued to its conclusion. Sheriff Dixon attempted to assert that any investigation of his department should be handled by local or state authorities, not the military. Colonel Pierce corrected him firmly, explaining that when military personnel and their families were subjected to harassment or civil rights violations, it became a matter of federal jurisdiction. The military had both the authority and the obligation to investigate such incidents. The colonel continued by noting that Commander Johnson held a top-secret security clearance and was currently on leave from classified operations. The fact that local law enforcement had detained and threatened him without cause raised potential security concerns that fell squarely within military oversight. This additional dimension seemed to dawn on Sheriff Dixon with fresh horror. Marcus remained quiet during these exchanges, his role now reduced to that of witness, while others handled the official response. The parking lot of Rosie's Diner had been transformed into something resembling a military staging area. Personnel moved with practiced efficiency around the 3 black vehicles, while local onlookers maintained a respectful distance behind a perimeter that had been quietly but firmly established. Marcus stood with his family near their own vehicle, a modest sedan that looked almost quaint next to the military transport trucks. Colonel Pierce had gathered Sheriff Dixon and his deputies to one side for what appeared to be a very serious conversation. The body language of the 3 local officers had shifted dramatically from their earlier aggressive confidence to something approaching genuine concern. They stood at attention despite not being military personnel, responding to the colonel's questions with increasing discomfort. Elena was buckling Maya into her car seat when Admiral Hayes's voice came through Marcus's watch again. The holographic display activated once more, showing the Admiral's image in miniature above the device. She asked if the situation had been secured and if Commander Johnson's family was safe to travel. Marcus confirmed that Colonel Pierce and his team had arrived and that they were preparing to head home. The Admiral requested a private word with Marcus. He stepped a few feet away from his family and switched the watch to a more secure mode. Admiral Hayes's tone became less formal as she asked how he was really doing. Marcus appreciated the genuine concern in her question and admitted that while he was physically fine, he was angry and frustrated that his children had been exposed to such treatment. Admiral Hayes understood completely. She had children of her own and could imagine how violated Marcus must feel. She assured him that this incident would not be swept aside or minimized. The full resources of military legal affairs were already being mobilized, and she had personally spoken with the Secretary of Defense about the matter. This would be taken seriously at the highest levels of government. Marcus thanked the Admiral for her intervention but expressed concern about the attention this might bring. He had always preferred to serve quietly without seeking recognition or media coverage. Admiral Hayes acknowledged his preference, but pointed out that some situations required public accountability. The harassment of military families could not be tolerated, and making an example of this case might prevent future incidents. The conversation concluded with Admiral Hayes ordering Marcus to take an additional week of leave beyond what he had already scheduled. She stated that his family deserved time to recover from this trauma, without him being pulled back to duty prematurely. Marcus tried to object, thinking of his responsibilities to his crew and mission, but the Admiral made it clear this was an order, not a suggestion. After ending the call, Marcus returned to his family. Danny asked who his father had been talking to, and Marcus explained it was one of his commanding officers checking to make sure they were okay. The boy seemed satisfied with this answer, though Elena caught her husband's eye with a look that said they would discuss everything in more detail once the children were asleep. Colonel Pierce finished his conversation with the local law enforcement officers and walked over to Marcus. He explained that a formal investigation would begin immediately, and that Sheriff Dixon and his deputies had been ordered to preserve all evidence and make themselves available for interviews. The colonel had also contacted state authorities to ensure proper oversight of the local department during the investigation. Marcus asked what would happen to the officers involved. Colonel Pierce was honest in his response, explaining that would depend on what the investigation revealed and what charges might be filed. At minimum, there would likely be federal civil rights inquiries, and the officers could face consequences ranging from retraining to termination to criminal charges depending on the findings. The colonel added something that surprised Marcus. Multiple witnesses had already posted videos and accounts of the incident on social media, and it was beginning to spread rapidly across various platforms. By morning, this would likely be a national news story. Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach at this news, hating the idea of becoming a public spectacle, but Colonel Pierce pointed out that public awareness might ensure proper accountability. Betty emerged from the diner carrying a large bag. She approached the family and handed it to Elena, explaining that she had packed some food for the drive home and breakfast items for the morning. She also slipped a note into Elena's hand with her personal phone number, saying that if the family ever needed anything or just wanted to talk, they should not hesitate to call. Elena hugged the older woman, both of them having tears in their eyes. Betty told Marcus that she was proud to have met him and ashamed of how her town had treated his family. Marcus assured her that she bore no responsibility for the actions of others and that her kindness had been a light in a dark situation. Several other diner patrons who had witnessed the incident came over to express their support before the family departed. The older veteran shook Marcus's hand again and said something that stuck with him. The man stated that he had served in the old military before humanity reached the stars, and he recognized a good soldier when he saw one. He was sorry that Marcus had to fight prejudice at home after fighting aliens in space. Danny tugged on his father's sleeve and asked quietly if they could leave now. Marcus could see the exhaustion in his son's face and realized that despite the boy's earlier curiosity, the stress of the evening had taken its toll. Maya was already half asleep again in her car seat. It was definitely time to go home. Colonel Pierce outlined the security arrangement for the trip. One vehicle would lead, the Johnson family would follow in the middle, and a third vehicle would take up the rear. The drive to their home was approximately 2 hours, and the escort would remain with them until they were safely inside. Marcus accepted these arrangements without argument, recognizing that protocol served a purpose beyond just his personal preferences. The convoy prepared to depart. Marcus took the driver's seat with Elena beside him. As they pulled out of the diner parking lot, he glanced in the rearview mirror at the building that would forever be connected to one of the strangest nights of his life. Betty stood in the doorway waving, and Marcus raised a hand in farewell. The drive home was quiet for the first hour. Both children fell asleep quickly, worn out by the emotional intensity of the evening. Elena held Marcus's hand across the center console, not speaking but providing silent support. The military vehicles ahead and behind maintained a professional distance, visible enough to be reassuring but not so close as to feel oppressive. Eventually, Elena broke the silence by asking Marcus what would happen next. He admitted he was not entirely sure. There would be investigations and probably media attention. He might be asked to give statements or testimony. The whole thing could drag on for months. Elena absorbed this information and then asked how he was really feeling about it all. Marcus took a moment to organize his thoughts before responding. He said that part of him wanted to just let it go, to take his family home and move on with their lives. But another part of him, the part that had sworn an oath to protect people, recognized that staying silent would be a betrayal of those values. If he did not stand up for what happened to his family, who would stand up for the next family facing similar treatment? Elena squeezed his hand and told him she supported whatever decision he made. She trusted his judgment and knew that he would always put their family first, but she also admitted that she was angry, angrier than she had been in a long time. The officers had frightened her children and made them feel unsafe in their own country. That was not something she could easily forgive or forget. They discussed how to talk with Danny and Maya about what had happened. The children were young but smart, and they would have questions. Marcus and Elena agreed that they needed to be honest while still age-appropriate, helping their kids understand that what happened was wrong, but also that good people were working to make it right. As they drove through the dark Montana countryside, Marcus thought about all the times he had been told he was fighting for humanity's future, the battles against the wrecks, the defense of colonies, the exploration of hostile space. All of it was supposedly about protecting human civilization and values. Yet here on Earth, the values he fought for seemed fragile and unevenly applied. He wondered what his crew would think when they heard about this incident. Many of them were from diverse backgrounds, coming together from different cultures and planets to serve a common purpose. In space, differences in appearance meant nothing when facing hostile aliens or navigating dangerous situations. Everyone was judged by their competence and character, not by superficial characteristics. Elena noticed Marcus's contemplative silence and asked what he was thinking about. He shared some of his thoughts and she nodded in understanding. She reminded him that for all its flaws, humanity was still worth fighting for. Progress was slow and uneven, but it happened because people like Marcus refused to accept injustice and stood up for what was right. The convoy approached the town where the Johnson family lived, a small community that was considerably more diverse and welcoming than the rural area surrounding Rosie's diner. Morning arrived with bright sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows. Marcus woke early out of habit, his internal clock set by years of military schedules. He lay still for a moment, listening to the peaceful sounds of his home and trying to convince himself that the previous evening had not been a bad dream. The soreness in his shoulders from sustained tension reminded him it had been all too real. Elena was still sleeping, and Marcus decided to let her rest. He moved quietly through the house, checking on Danny and Maya before heading to the kitchen to make coffee. As the machine brewed, he checked his phone and found dozens of messages from fellow officers, old friends, and even some family members who had somehow already heard about the incident. The news had indeed spread faster than he had expected. A quick search showed that videos from the diner were circulating widely on social media platforms. Several had been viewed millions of times overnight. News organizations were picking up the story, with headlines about a decorated war hero being harassed by police. Marcus's military photograph was appearing alongside articles, his service record being discussed by people who had never met him. He felt uncomfortable with the attention but recognized that it was beyond his control now. The story had taken on a life of its own. Some of the coverage was thoughtful and focused on broader issues of discrimination and police accountability. Other coverage sensationalized the confrontation or used it to push various political agendas. Marcus tried not to read too much of any of it, knowing it would only increase his frustration. His phone rang with a call from Colonel Pierce. The colonel apologized for the early contact but explained that media requests were flooding military public affairs offices. They needed guidance on how Marcus wanted to handle the situation. Did he want to make a statement? Would he agree to interviews? How much personal information was he comfortable having released? Marcus appreciated being consulted rather than just having decisions made for him. He told the colonel that he preferred to maintain as much privacy as possible, but understood that some level of public engagement might be necessary. He absolutely did not want his children's images or full names released to media. Elena would need to be consulted on any decisions that affected her as well. Colonel Pierce assured him that the family's privacy would be protected to the maximum extent possible. However, he recommended that Marcus consider releasing a brief official statement soon, if only to get ahead of the narrative and ensure his perspective was represented. Marcus agreed to discuss it with Elena and get back to him within a few hours. Danny emerged from his bedroom as Marcus ended the call, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The boy climbed onto a kitchen stool and asked his father if the police were going to come to their house. Marcus heard the worry in his son's voice and quickly reassured him that no, the police would not be bothering them anymore, and that there were people making sure the family was safe. Danny nodded but still looked troubled. He asked why those officers had been so mean if they were supposed to be the good guys. Marcus struggled with how to answer such an innocent question with a complicated truth. He finally explained that most officers were good people trying to help their communities, but sometimes individuals made bad choices or let prejudice affect their judgment. The important thing was that there were systems in place to hold people accountable when they did wrong. Elena joined them in the kitchen, and Marcus filled her in on the morning's developments. She looked at the news coverage on his phone and sighed deeply. She had known this would happen, but had hoped for more time before dealing with it. They agreed to work together on a statement, and to keep the children away from media as much as possible. Maya woke up in better spirits than the previous evening, seemingly less affected by the trauma than her older brother. Children were resilient, but Marcus knew they would both carry memories of what happened. He and Elena would need to watch for any lasting effects, and be ready to seek professional support if needed. The morning took on a surreal quality as the Johnson family tried to maintain normal routines while fielding constant interruptions. Neighbors stopped by to express support and concern. Marcus's parents called from their retirement home on Mars, having seen the news and wanting to make sure their son and grandchildren were okay. Elena's sister called with a similar mixture of outrage and worry. Around mid-morning, Colonel Pierce called again with an update. The investigation was moving rapidly due to the clear evidence and high-profile nature of the case. Sheriff Dixon and his deputies had been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending the outcome. The governor of Montana had issued a public statement condemning the officers' behavior and promising a thorough review of the local department. More significantly, federal prosecutors had taken interest in the case. They were considering charges under civil rights statutes that could carry serious penalties. The recordings from Marcus's watch, Betty's security cameras, and multiple witness phones had provided overwhelming documentation of what occurred. The officers' own body camera footage, when it was reviewed, contradicted many of their initial claims about the incident. Marcus asked about Betty and whether she was facing any retaliation for her support. Colonel Pierce reported that the diner owner had actually seen a surge in business from people wanting to show support. Several veterans groups had organized to eat there as a show of solidarity. Betty had given an interview to a local news station in which she spoke eloquently about the importance of standing up for what was, right. Elena worked on drafting a statement while Marcus handled the children and dealt with ongoing communications. She was a skilled writer and managed to craft something that was dignified, factual, and focused on the broader issues rather than just their personal experience. She emphasized their hope that the incident would lead to meaningful reform and better training for law enforcement. By early afternoon, they had finalized the statement and sent it to Colonel Pierce for release through official channels. Within an hour, it was being quoted in news coverage and shared across social media. The response was overwhelmingly supportive, though there were inevitably some who tried to justify the officer's actions or question Marcus's account. Despite the video evidence, Marcus received a call from Admiral Hayes again. She informed him that the United Earth Space Command was considering using this incident as a catalyst for a broader initiative on protecting service members and their families from discrimination. They were exploring partnerships with civil rights organizations and looking at ways to provide better support and legal resources for military personnel facing similar situations. The Admiral also mentioned that several other service members had come forward with their own stories of harassment or discrimination, inspired by Marcus's experience going public. His decision to speak up, even reluctantly, was already having ripple effects throughout the military community. Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions about this. Glad that others might find justice, but sad that such stories existed in the first place. Danny asked if he could go outside and play with friends in the neighborhood. Marcus and Elena discussed it briefly and decided to allow it, not wanting to keep the children isolated or let fear control their lives. However, Marcus watched from the window to ensure everything remained safe and normal. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A black sedan pulled up to the house and a woman in a business suit emerged. She identified herself as Lisa Morgan from the Department of Justice and asked if she could speak with Marcus and Elena about the incident. Marcus invited her inside after verifying her credentials. Lisa explained that the Justice Department was launching a formal investigation into potential civil rights violations. She needed to take detailed statements from both Marcus and Elena about everything that occurred at the diner. The process took several hours, with Lisa recording their accounts and asking clarifying questions about specific details and timeline. She also asked about the broader context of their experience. Had they faced discrimination before? Did they feel safe in their community? What outcomes would they like to see from the investigation? Marcus and Elena answered everything honestly, trying to provide useful information without making the conversation more about revenge than justice. Lisa assured them that the government took these matters very seriously. The evidence in this case was exceptionally strong, and there was political will at high levels to ensure accountability. She could not promise specific outcomes but indicated that significant consequences for the officers involved were very likely. After Lisa departed, Marcus and Elena felt emotionally drained. They had relived the incident multiple times now through various retellings and statements. Maya asked why the serious lady had needed to talk to her parents for so long. Elena explained simply that she was helping to make sure the bad thing that happened would not happen to other families. Evening came and the family tried to have a normal dinner together. Marcus had picked up groceries earlier and cooked one of the children's favorite meals. They talked about school, upcoming activities, and plans for the rest of his leave that had nothing to do with diners or police officers. It felt good to focus on ordinary family life. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity that Marcus had never anticipated when he requested his leave. What should have been quiet family time became a careful balancing act between protecting his children's normalcy and engaging with the growing movement for accountability that his experience had sparked. News of the diner incident had spread across Earth and throughout the colony worlds, becoming a touchstone for broader conversations about justice and discrimination. Marcus watched the morning news with Elena 1 week after the incident, seeing their story discussed alongside analysis of policing practices across the country. Legal experts debated the likely charges against the officers. Social commentators placed the incident in historical context. Politicians weighed in with varying degrees of sincerity about the need for reform. The governor of Montana appeared at a press conference to announce a comprehensive investigation into law enforcement practices statewide. She stood beside community leaders and civil rights advocates, acknowledging that the Johnson family's experience was unacceptable and promising systemic changes. Marcus appreciated the attention being paid to the issue, but remained skeptical about whether political promises would translate into meaningful action. Colonel Pierce called with updates almost daily. The military investigation had concluded its initial phase and confirmed what everyone already knew from the recordings. The officers had engaged in harassment without legal justification, motivated at least in part by discriminatory bias. The report would be forwarded to federal prosecutors along with recommendations for charges. More significantly, the incident had prompted the United Earth Space Command to review how it protected service members and their families from discrimination. Admiral Hayes was personally overseeing a new initiative to provide legal support, advocacy, and resources for military personnel facing similar situations. Marcus had been asked to consult on the program, sharing his perspective on what would have been helpful during his experience. Elena received a call from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell their story in depth. After discussing it together, they declined the offer, feeling that they had shared enough publicly and wanting to preserve some privacy for their family. However, they did agree to participate in a panel discussion organized by a veterans advocacy group. Feeling that direct engagement might be more productive than media spectacle, Danny had returned to school and quickly discovered that his father's fame had preceded him. Classmates and even some teachers treated him differently, asking questions about the incident and about Marcus's military service. The attention was uncomfortable for the boy who just wanted things to be normal again. Marcus and Elena spoke with the school administration about protecting Danny's privacy and helping him navigate the situation. Maya seemed less affected by the lingering attention, though she had started asking more questions about fairness and rules. She wanted to understand why the police officers had been mean, and whether all police were like that. Marcus and Elena did their best to explain that most officers were good people doing a hard job, but that everyone, including police, needed to be held accountable when they did wrong. The support from the military community had been overwhelming. Care packages arrived at the house from units Marcus had never served with. Letters came from junior officers thanking him for standing up and setting an example. Veterans groups added the Johnson family to their advocacy work, using the incident to push for better protections and training. But not all the attention was positive. Marcus also received hate mail from people who believed he had overreacted or played the victim. Anonymous messages accused him of trying to get officers in trouble for doing their jobs. A few were openly racist, revealing the ugly prejudice that lurked beneath surface civility. Marcus deleted these messages without reading most of them, refusing to let that poison into his mind. Elena dealt with her own challenges. Some of her friends did not understand why the family was making such a big deal of what they saw as a misunderstanding. A few suggested that Marcus should have just complied more quickly or been less confrontational, ignoring the fact that he had been completely cooperative throughout. These interactions were painful and revealed assumptions Elena had not realized her friends held. 2 weeks after the incident, the Department of Justice announced formal charges against all 3 officers involved. Sheriff Dixon faced federal civil rights violations and abuse of authority. Deputy Harris and Officer Norton were charged similarly, with additional charges related to their specific actions and statements. The announcement came at a press conference that Marcus watched from his living room, feeling a complex mix of vindication and sadness. The prosecutor handling the case was a serious woman named Patricia Gomez, who had built her career on civil rights enforcement. She spoke clearly about the evidence and the government's commitment to holding law enforcement accountable when they violated the rights of citizens. She emphasized that this prosecution was not anti-police but rather pro-justice, about ensuring that everyone received equal treatment under the law. Marcus received a call from Patricia's office asking if he would be willing to testify if the case went to trial. He agreed without hesitation, though he dreaded the prospect of reliving the incident under cross-examination. Elena would likely be called as well, and they began preparing mentally for that possibility. The local community where the diner was located had divided reactions to the developments. Some residents supported the officers and resented the outside attention and criticism. Others were embarrassed by what had happened and welcomed the accountability. Betty reported that her diner had become something of a pilgrimage site, with people stopping by to show support or simply to see where the incident occurred. Marcus made a quiet trip back to the diner one afternoon, wanting to thank Betty personally again and check on how she was handling everything. She was doing well, busier than ever with the increased traffic. She had added a small plaque near the booth where the Johnson family had sat, with a simple message about dignity, justice, and standing up for what was right. They sat together over coffee, and Betty shared that she had been interviewed by numerous news outlets and had become an accidental advocate for treating everyone with respect. She had started speaking to community groups about what she witnessed and why it mattered. Marcus was touched by her ongoing commitment and told her that her initial willingness to speak up had meant more than any official investigation. Admiral Hayes requested a meeting with Marcus at a military facility about an hour from his home. When he arrived, he found not just the admiral but several other high-ranking officers and civilian officials from various government agencies. They wanted his input on new training programs and policies designed to prevent similar incidents and support service members who face discrimination. Marcus shared his perspective honestly. He talked about the helplessness he felt watching his children be frightened, while knowing that any aggressive response from him would be used against him. He discussed the importance of clear documentation and quick intervention by command structure. He emphasized that prevention through better training and accountability was preferable to after-the-fact punishment. The officials listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions. Several shared their own experiences or those of family members who had faced discrimination. Marcus left the meeting feeling that genuine efforts were being made to address systemic issues. Though he remained realistic about how long real change would take, the story began to reach beyond Earth and its immediate colonies. News services on distant worlds picked up the narrative, using it to examine how humanity's expansion into space had, or had not, resolved the old problems of prejudice and inequality. Some colony worlds had developed more egalitarian societies, while others had replicated or even amplified Earth's divisions. Marcus received a message from the captain of a ship serving near the Proxima system, a woman who had faced similar harassment on Earth years earlier. She thanked him for speaking up, and shared that his example had inspired her to finally file a formal complaint about her own experience. Marcus realized that his decision to go public was encouraging others to seek justice for past wrongs. The media attention gradually began to shift from the specific incident to broader policy questions. News programs hosted debates about police reform, civil rights protections for military families, and the persistence of discrimination in society. Marcus's name came up less frequently as the focus moved to systemic issues, which he appreciated. Danny came home from school one day with an assignment about heroes and courage. He had chosen to write about his father, not because of the military achievements, but because of how Marcus had stayed calm and protected his family during the diner incident. Reading his son's essay brought tears to Marcus's eyes and reminded him why speaking up had been the right choice despite the difficulties. Elena organized a gathering of military spouses who had faced similar challenges. The group met at their home for an informal discussion of experiences and strategies for supporting each other. Marcus listened from another room as the spouses shared stories that ranged from frustrating to heartbreaking. 6 weeks after the incident, Marcus drove his family back to Rosie's diner. The decision had not been easy, and they had discussed it at length before agreeing that returning would be an important step in reclaiming the location from its negative associations. Danny was nervous but excited, while Maya seemed unbothered, viewing it simply as another family outing. The parking lot was fuller than it had been that evening, and Marcus noticed several vehicles with veteran organization bumper stickers. As they entered, Betty looked up from behind the counter and her face broke into a genuine smile. She hurried over to greet them with warm hugs, telling them how much it meant that they had come back. The interior of the diner had changed subtly. Along one wall, Betty had created a tribute section honoring local veterans and space service members. Photographs and small plaques recognized individuals who had served, with Marcus's official portrait displayed prominently alongside his commendations. Other photos showed diverse faces from different eras and conflicts, a reminder of sacrifice and service across generations. Several patrons recognized the family and approached to express support. A retired Marine shook Marcus's hand and thanked him for his service both in space and in standing up for what was right. A young couple mentioned that they had been following the story and were glad to see accountability moving forward. The attention was kind rather than intrusive, and Marcus appreciated the genuine warmth behind it. They sat at a different booth this time, not wanting to claim any special significance for the location where the incident occurred. Betty brought menus and told them that this meal was on the house, absolutely refusing any argument. She had tears in her eyes as she explained that having them back meant the world to her, and showed that fear and injustice had not won. The meal was peaceful and almost normal, exactly what Marcus had hoped for. They talked about the upcoming lecture at the military academy and about his return to duty in a few weeks. Danny shared excitement about a science project going better than his volcano experiment. Maya colored on her placemat and occasionally commented on the food. As they finished eating, a state police officer entered the diner. Marcus felt Elena tense beside him, and he reached over to squeeze her hand reassuringly. The officer was an older man with kind eyes who approached their table with obvious respect. He introduced himself as Captain Frank Morrison, the new supervisor for the region. Captain Morrison asked if he could speak with them briefly. Marcus agreed, though he remained cautious. The captain explained that he had taken over responsibility for reforming law enforcement practices in the area following the incident. He wanted to personally apologize for what the family had endured and to assure them that comprehensive changes were being implemented. The captain described new training protocols, revised policies on interactions with the public, and enhanced accountability measures. He acknowledged that one incident should never have happened in the first place, but expressed commitment to ensuring it would not happen again. Marcus listened carefully and asked pointed questions about specific details of the reforms. Captain Morrison answered every question directly and provided documentation about the changes being made. He also shared his personal cell phone number, telling Marcus that if his family ever had any concerns or issues in the area, they should contact him immediately. The gesture seemed genuine, and Marcus accepted it as such while remaining mindful that lasting change would take time to prove itself. After the captain departed, Elena commented quietly that she wanted to believe things would improve, but found it hard to trust quickly after what they had experienced. Marcus understood completely and shared her caution. They agreed to judge the reforms by their long-term results rather than immediate promises. The family spent another hour at the diner, with Marcus and Elena having coffee while the children played a quiet game. Other patrons came and went, and the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. When they finally prepared to leave, Betty walked them to the door and hugged each family member, making them promise to stop by whenever they were in the area. The drive home was lighter than the tense journey weeks earlier. Danny declared that the return visit had been good and helped him feel less scared about what happened. Maya asked if they could go back to the diner again sometime because she liked Betty's kindness. Elena and Marcus agreed that they could, feeling that an important step toward healing had been taken. 2 days later, Marcus stood at a podium before several hundred cadets at the military academy. The lecture hall was packed with additional attendees watching via video link from other locations. He wore his full dress uniform with his decorations displayed, though the clothes felt somehow less important than the message he was there to deliver. He spoke for over an hour about leadership, courage, and the values that defined humanity's best qualities. He shared stories from combat that illustrated tactical principles and strategic thinking. But he devoted significant time to the diner incident, walking through what happened and what it revealed about the society they all served to protect. Marcus challenged the future officers to think beyond military victory to the kind of world they wanted to create and defend. He emphasized that standing up for dignity and justice in everyday situations was just as important as battlefield heroism, perhaps more so because it shaped the character of their civilization. The cadets listened with rapt attention, many taking detailed notes. During the question period, a young cadet asked how Marcus had maintained his composure during the harassment. Marcus answered honestly that his military training had helped, but more importantly, he had been focused on protecting his children and modeling appropriate behavior for them. He explained that true strength often meant restraint rather than retaliation. Another cadet asked whether the experience had made him question his service. Marcus paused before responding, acknowledging that it had been painful to face discrimination in the society he defended. But ultimately, it had reinforced his commitment to the values embedded in his oath, values that required constant work to uphold, and that sometimes meant speaking uncomfortable truths. After the lecture, numerous cadets approached to thank him and ask follow-up questions. Several shared their own experiences with discrimination or with standing up against injustice. Marcus was moved by their stories and by the genuine thoughtfulness with which these young officers were approaching their responsibilities. The Academy Commandant, a distinguished admiral named Victor Chen, spoke with Marcus privately afterward. He said the lecture had been exactly what the cadets needed to hear, a reminder that their duties extended beyond tactical competence to moral leadership. He asked Marcus to consider returning periodically to continue challenging and inspiring future generations of officers. Marcus returned home energized by the experience at the academy. Elena could see the change in him and asked what had made such an impact. He explained that engaging with idealistic young officers had reminded him why he served and had given him hope, that the next generation would build on the progress being made. The foundation that bore the Johnson family name was now fully operational and already helping its first clients. A Navy family facing harassment in their community received legal representation. An Air Force officer dealing with discriminatory treatment in her chain of command got advocacy support. Each case represented someone who might otherwise have faced injustice alone, and Marcus felt proud that their painful experience was enabling help for others. News came that the trial date for the 3 officers had been set for 6 months in the future. Patricia Gomez called to begin preparing Marcus and Elena for their testimony. The process would be challenging, requiring them to relive the incident in detail under hostile cross-examination. But they were ready to do it, understanding that accountability required following through to the end. Marcus's final weeks of leave were spent in quiet family activities and preparations for his return to duty. He reviewed technical manuals for the Unity, communicated with his future crew, and mentally prepared for the transition from father at home to commander in space. The balance between these roles had always been challenging, but recent events had clarified his priorities and commitments. Danny asked his father one evening whether being a commander meant he had to be serious all the time. Marcus laughed and assured his son that leadership required many qualities, but that humor, compassion, and humanity were just as important as discipline and authority. He hoped the lesson would stay with Danny as the boy grew and faced his own challenges. Maya drew a picture of the Unity based on images she had seen, decorating it with stars and planets and a tiny figure in the captain's chair labeled, Daddy. Marcus hung the drawing in his home office where he could see it during video calls with his crew, a reminder of what truly mattered beneath all the responsibility and duty. Elena received an invitation to speak at a national conference on military family advocacy. After some consideration, she accepted, feeling that her perspective as a spouse who had experienced discrimination firsthand could contribute to important conversations. She was building her own form of service alongside Marcus's military career,